All right, we're continuing our discussion of sort of New Deal Part 1, which is 33 to 35. And we talked last time about FDR's effort to reform and save the banking system and sort of the direct relief parts of New Deal Part 1. But FDR knew that real relief would come only through recovery and cooperation in the agricultural and industrial sectors. And so two laws were passed, the most important legislation of the first 100 days, the Agricultural Adjustment Act, which was passed in May, and the National Industrial Recovery Act, which was passed in June. The first act created the Agricultural Adjustment Administration, also the same acronym, AAA, and the National Industrial Recovery Act, which is usually called the National Recovery Act, colloquially, produced the National Recovery Administration, NRA. And both were based on the idea that curtailing production would trigger economic recovery. Shrinking the supply of goods would restore normal market forces. It would reverse the downward spiral, create a positive spiral. That's what they were designed to do in both the agricultural and industrial sectors. Let's talk about agriculture first. The Agricultural Adjustment Administration began paying farmers to keep their land out of production or to reduce their herds of cattle or sheep or whatever. And we had the curious thing in 1933 when it was passed, crops were already planted, and so in 33 alone it had the effect of having farmers plow under good crops or kill part of their herd, even as people were starving. But we had to reverse the economic downward spiral, the price spiral. This was controversial, obviously, and farmers were initially very wary, but few refused the payments. The AAA unfortunately made no provision for tenant farmers and farm laborers who were thrown out of work with less land under production. They didn't think about that. It was an unintended consequence that we pay farmers not to grow stuff, that the poorest part of the agricultural sector, those that are landless, would be hurt. And in the South, the majority of these, of course, were black. Now, the AAA also proved inadequate to Great Plains farmers, who were experiencing, of course, an ecological as well as an economic disaster. Stripped of native grasses by decades of aggressive plowing, this constant western settlement, dust began to blow as the dirt dried up, sometimes as far away as 1,000 miles. Overplanting, the depression, and a drought, all hitting at the same time, created this horrible disaster. And this wasn't just, casual bit of dirt in the air. The worst storm was April 14th, 1935, when a mass of dust roared through Kansas, Colorado, and Oklahoma at speeds of 45 to 70 miles per hour, suffocating cattle and dumping thousands of tons of topsoil and red clay on homes and streets. The government responded with the creating something called the Soil Conservation Service as part of the Soil Conservation Act, which paid farmers to plant soil-conserving grasses and legumes in place of wheat. Wheat was more profitable, but they could get money from the government to offset that loss of profit by planting grasses and legumes to get the soil held in place. Besides, nothing was profitable during the Dust Bowl. New techniques like terracing were taught to conserve rainwater, get better absorption, and this helped. But again, almost too little too late. It did not help tenant farmers. It did not help laborers. Nearly 1 million tenant farmers left their homes in 1935, and another 2.5 million after that. These are the so-called Okies, and we'll talk a lot about this in class. Now, this plight of the farmer was greatly disturbing to Americans because the sturdy yeoman farmer was foundational to the American dream, after all. It was foundational to Jefferson's idea of what America would be. In 1936, the Supreme Court ruled that the AAA, the Agricultural Adjustment Act, mandated limits on farm production was illegal restraint of trade, struck down the entire law. The court was still very conservative and not really okay with giving the government the kind of power it was trying to take to resolve the Depression. Congress responded by passing the Soil Conservation and Domestic Allotment Acts, or Act, which I referred to a minute ago, which removed land from production for ecological rather than economic reasons. And so this helped, but it also required sharing of subsidies with tenant. Oh, it also required sharing of subsidies with tenant farmers because they realized they made a mistake with the AAA at first. But most landowners evaded this. And again, this didn't happen until '36. It was just really almost too late. The use of subsidies, government payments to farmers, did eventually bring some stability and mild prosperity to agriculture, but at a very high cost. The Department of Agriculture grew into a giant bureaucracy, which is almost impossible to kill today. And the rural poor never received a fair share of the federal benefits. Most of it went to larger farmers. Beginning in the 1930s and continuing to the 40s and 50s, many would continue to move to cities in the North and the West. Let's talk about the New Deal Part 1's effort to fix industry, the National Industrial Recovery Act, or the NRA. American industry was so vast, FDR never contemplated paying individual subsidies to reduce production like he'd done with agriculture. Instead, he relied on persuasion and association. The National Industrial Recovery Act founded the National Recovery Administration, the NRA, not to be confused with the National Rifle Association today, which FDR chose General Hugh Johnson, Brigadier General Hugh Johnson, to head. He had a lot of industrial planning experience from World War I. Johnson's first task was to persuade businesses to raise employee wages to a minimum of 30 to 40 cents an hour and limit those hours to 30 to 40 a week to employ as many people as possible. Now, Johnson went about his task by selling this whole NRA thing with a high-powered publicity campaign, including an NRA celebration at Yankee Stadium and a parade down Fifth Avenue. The NRA Blue Eagle sticker would show companies were doing their part. They get the sticker, put it in their window, and say, I'm helping out. Johnson also called together the largest producers in every sector of the economy to work out a code of fair competition and to restrict production. In the summer and fall of 1933, NRA codes were drawn up for many main sectors, and the economy picked up. It turned down again, however, in the winter and spring of '34, as many businesses learned to evade the code provisions. This is the old problem of pools or cartels. People cheat. Individuals cheat. They're not good at volunteerism, associationalism, as Hoover would have called it. And by the fall of 1934, it was clear that the NRA was a failure. The Supreme Court also declared it unconstitutional in May of 1935, said it was illegal restraint of trade, and after that it was allowed to quietly die. Now, in addition to establishing the NRA, which ultimately failed, the National Industrial Recovery Act also launched something called the PWA, the Public Works Administration, with $3.3 billion, more than Hoover's efforts had provided for this, to repair and build the infrastructure, roads, bridges, sewers, hospitals, airports, schools. Part of the really big part of this was the three major dams were built in the West: the Grand Coulee Dam, the Boulder Dam, which would be later named the Hoover Dam, and the Bonneville Dam. This would shrink relief rolls as people were employed to do this work, but was focused on really underlying development rather than short-term relief. This opened huge expanses of Arizona, California, and Washington to industrial and agricultural development. We'll talk more about this in a minute. Now, the PWA also funded construction of lots of other projects besides dams. It funded, for example, construction of the Triborough Bridge, one of the major bridges in Manhattan, connecting Manhattan, rather, with the rest of New York City. The 100-mile causeway to Key West. You may not be aware there's a 100-mile highway in the middle of the ocean connecting the Keys, ending in Key West. That was built as a part of this Depression era effort, and lots of other iconic American pieces of infrastructure. Now, very different from the NRA was the TVA, the Tennessee Valley Authority. This was established by the Tennessee Valley Authority Act in 1933, and this was a very direct government economic development. It was designed, it's like we want to spend money to develop the country and put people back to work. Where should we focus it? Obviously the poorest parts of the country, and some of that was Appalachia and the rural South. So the Tennessee Valley and its estuaries clearly were in need of development, and so it was designed to control flooding in the valley, generate electricity, hydroelectric power, develop local industry like fertilizer production, improve navigability. If locks and dams could make these rivers navigable, then that would increase transportation, and that infrastructure would create economic growth. And finally, to ease poverty and isolation, which was extreme in the area. The mandate resembled the PWA, but enjoyed greater authority. And the resulting structure that was built, the TVA, which still exists today, is part of the government. It's not a private enterprise. New dealers like Rexford Tugwell, one of the advisors with whom FDR surrounded himself, really wanted like this. He wanted a government-planned, government-operated economy. Now, that may sound ominous. They didn't say so, but they were really drawn to the idea of socialism. And the TVA is a little bit of that in America. The TVA's results were impressive. They built or improved more than 20 dams. One of them is the Wheeler Dam near Muscle Shoals, Alabama, near here. They became, for a while, the largest producer of electricity in the U.S. with some of the lowest rates compared to other utilities. They built waterways to bypass the non-navigable areas of the river. They did reduce flooding as planned. They taught farmers to prevent soil erosion, to use fertilizer, increased agricultural productivity in this area. Although the TVA was a major New Deal success, it generated little support for a national version. This is an important point. Assuming control of established banks and industries directly by the government, sort of what Cardenas did with oil in Mexico, that would have been very different than than bringing help to one impoverished region. And FDR and most officials did not favor that kind of radical growth in government power. The New Deal never embraced the idea of the federal government substituting private enterprise. So his critics claimed that FDR was very socialist, but he really wasn't. In fact, he helped capitalism. He gave it a crutch until it got back on its feet. The New Deal was, in fact, ideologically pretty conservative. Now, the TVA showed what the New Deal could do to transform a region. And New York City, I mentioned the Triborough Bridge, it benefited because of, why do you think it benefited from a lot of New Deal projects? Because of FDR. He was governor of New York. But no region was changed like the West. Between 1933 and 1939, the per capita payments for public works, welfare, and federal loans in the Rocky Mountain and Pacific states far outstripped all other areas. Central to this was this dam building, this very expensive dam building we discussed earlier. Western business and agriculture wanted the rivers dammed to provide water and electricity for urban development and agriculture, but the costs were prohibitive. The New Deal, through the PWA, provided financing. The Boulder, later Hoover Dam, provided drinking water for Southern California, irrigation for California's Imperial Valley, electricity for California and southern Arizona. It also authorized the Central Valley Project and the All-America Canal, vast water harnessing projects in central and southern California to provide drinking water, irrigation, and electricity to large areas. The biggest project was the Grand Coulee Dam on the Columbia River in Washington, creating a 150-mile-long lake. Together with the Bonneville Dam, it gave the Pacific Northwest the cheapest electricity in the country, creating a huge potential for population and economic growth. These dams made Washington the highest per capita beneficiary of the New Deal. All these developments attracted less attention in the 1930s than the TVA, in part because the benefits were not fully realized until after World War II. Also not as radical because, unlike the TVA, these projects hired private contractors to do the work, making many of them very rich. So here we see benefits of the New Deal flowing to real estate and large farming interest, not really to the poor. They were intended to aid private enterprise, not replace it, again stressing the fundamental conservatism of the New Deal.